Boldwood presents Hidden Family Secrets, written by Evelyn Hood and read by Abby Andrews. To my mother, Millie Webster Steele. I had a dove, and the sweet dove died, and I have thought it died of grieving. Oh, what could it grieve for? Its feet were tied, with a silken thread of my own hands weaving. John Keats. Part 1. Chapter 1. For the third time since they left Bath, Meg's stomach began to rebel against the cart's lurching progress. She tried hard to fight down the queasiness, both hands squeezed tightly against her stomach, beneath the shelter of her shawl. But finally, she had to twitch at Duncan's sleeve, until he moved his blue eyes from contemplation of the farmland to her white, apologetic face. "Duncan, I'm feared I'm—" "Not again," her husband said impatiently. "Do you want us to take 2 days to make this journey?" "I can't help it." She pressed her hand over her mouth and made to jump from the moving vehicle in her haste to get out before she disgraced herself, and him, completely. "You'd best stop." Duncan tapped the driver on the shoulder, and he, without a backward glance at his passengers, drew the horses to a halt and waited, back hunched. The animals immediately began to tear at the dry, dusty grass fringing the road, twitching their ears and flicking their tails to ward off flies. With Duncan's help, Meg scrambled down from the cart and stumbled over the springy turf. She reached the shelter of a whin bush just in time and knelt on the grass, vomiting miserably and wishing she was back home in the farm kitchen with her family. It had seemed such an adventure when they first planned it. Duncan, a weaver by trade, was young and ambitious, and in 1745 the flourishing Renfrewshire town of Paisley, some 20 miles away, was the ideal place for a young man willing to work. Meg was the envy of her sisters. To be a married woman with a handsome, husky, young husband like Duncan, she knew herself how fortunate she was. But now the first sweet shyness of marriage had passed, and she had begun to realise that this dark, confident man was hers, and she his, for the rest of her life. She was bound to follow him wherever he chose to lead. The thought, which had excited her as she danced with him at her wedding, beneath the familiar smoke-grimed beams of home, now made her shiver, despite the warm May sun above. What if they didn't fare well? What if she hated Paisley, yet had to go on living there, homesick and wretched? She stood up and glanced at the cart, waiting on the track a short distance away. Duncan had stepped down to stretch his legs. The driver, a man of few words, sat hunched on the cart, a sombre figure against the blue sky beyond. Another spasm dragged her back to her knees. All at once she wanted her mother, though she had been glad enough to escape her sharp eyes a few hours earlier. "If you have your wits about you, you'll see that there are no babies until you're settled," her mother had advised as she brushed Meg's hair on her wedding morning. "You've chosen a wild man. See that he makes enough silver to put food for your belly and a roof over your head before you think further." Meg, breathless with loving anticipation, had promised easily enough. She never disobeyed her mother, who was not slow to show her displeasure with a clout on the ear that could send even a full-grown son or daughter flying across the room. But common sense had no chance when she was safely wedded and bedded, and Duncan's youthful passion was sweeping them both headlong on the course they had longed to take since they first set eyes on each other. When the first signs of nausea and giddiness appeared within a few weeks of their wedding day, Meg had done her utmost to hide them from the older woman, and had eagerly agreed to Duncan's proposal that they join the growing army of people lured by Paisley's expanding linen industry. She had succeeded in her deception, for her mother still had no inkling of her condition. Meg spat to rid her mouth of a bitter aftertaste and walked back to the men. "You took your time, lady," Duncan greeted her impatiently. "Early afternoon, I said we'd be there. Do you think we have a whole day to waste on one short journey?" "I couldn't help it," she said faintly, apologetically, as he handed her up to her seat and swung up beside her. His round, handsome face was marred by a scowl. Like his mother-in-law, Duncan felt that their first child should have had the sense to wait a little longer for its conception, and he was inclined to blame Meg for her haste. The driver had lit his pipe during the wait. Meg's insides quivered as a whiff of strong-smelling tobacco drifted back to her, and panic swept over her. Duncan would never stand for another delay. She squirmed into a position that put her tip-tilted nose out of the way of the smoke and sniffed at the grass-scented air with great determination. Duncan took the slight move away from him as a sign that his wife was annoyed. Compassion flooded his heart as he looked at the soft curve of her cheek and the corner of her kissable mouth. He loved her in his own irresponsible way, and his spirits rose with every turn of the wheels that carried them to their new life. An orphan, raised by an elderly aunt who cared little about anything but her Bible, he had found Meg's large, noisy family oppressive. He wanted to be independent, to look after his wife, and make his own decisions. If he couldn't make his way in Paisley, well, he'd go elsewhere. But wherever he went, he wanted Meg by his side. It was almost 2:00 when the driver raised his whip and pointed. "That's where you're bound." They craned their necks to see. Paisley was tucked snugly below the Gleneffer Braes, the Muckle Rigs, as they were known locally. The main features to be seen from a distance were the high church steeple and the ruins of the abbey, once a great monastic house, but now in a state of disrepair. Smoke from the chimneys smudged the green of the surrounding hills. The river cart was a shiny ribbon curling through the town, passing beneath the abbey walls. Duncan put his arm about Meg. "There's where we'll find our fortune." "You think so?" she asked doubtfully. "I know so. Paisley's growing, and we'll grow with it. We'll have our own place before long, and our own looms, and sons to carry the trade on after me." His voice was strong, his optimism catching. "You'll see, Meg. You'll see." The fields and hedges blossomed with great stretches of linen as the cart neared the town. These were the bleach fields, where newly woven linen was brought to whiten. Then the first cottages, some thatched and some with slate roofs, appeared on either side of the low rutted road. Duncan fingered his plain jacket as he looked at the young men strolling along the pathways of raised earth, stylishly clad in blue and green coats, nankeen breeches and flowered waistcoats. Meg's eyes widened as she stared at the women's colourful dresses. Obviously, Paisley was the very place for an ambitious young couple like themselves. The sound of hammering came to them as they passed through the town's fringes, where new houses were being built. Paisley was growing fast, and there was plenty of work for builders. Hard work, if they were to keep up with the demand from the constant stream of incomers. At last the cart jolted into the rutted main street, busy with carts and carriages. Housewives hurried along the footpaths or stood gossiping in tight groups. A crowd of young men laughed and joked outside a house, and judging by the state of one of them, kept on his feet by his companions, they had been inside sampling the landlord's wares. Bewhiskered businessmen paced solemnly, brushing barefoot children aside like flies, too involved in their own fat-bellied importance to notice their surroundings. Dogs, cats, and pigs were amiable company for each other as they nosed among the refuse at the sides of the road. After the pure country air they had just driven through, the travellers found the smell of rotting rubbish offensive, but they knew that they would quickly get used to it. It wasn't any worse than the dung heap that sat just outside the farm door in Bath. "Here 'tis," the driver announced. With a final squeeze of Meg's hand, Duncan jumped briskly down and rapped at the door of the 3-storey building. While he waited for an answer, he handed his wife down from the cart, and she looked timidly at the buildings crowding in on the narrow street. Had she been alone, she would have turned round there and then and ordered the driver to take her home again. But, being a married woman, she could only clutch the bag that held her worldly possessions and swallow hard. The door burst open suddenly, and a small tornado whirled out of it, almost knocking Meg over with the force of its passing. With a squeak of alarm, she clutched at the cart for support, while the tornado, which turned out to be a red-headed infant no higher than her knees, recovered its balance and headed, in determined fashion, down the street, skipping nimbly over holes and hillocks. "Stop that, Wayne!" A voice shrieked from inside the house, and a plump young woman, her own head topped with glowing red hair, came hurrying along the passageway. "Get hold of him, quick!" she shrilled, and Duncan, who had been standing open-mouthed, shot off down the street after the child. "The wee imp!" The woman leaned on the doorframe to catch her breath. "The times I've told these men to make sure the door's not left on the latch. Do they think I've nothing to do with my time but chase after him?" Then Duncan was back, a screaming, kicking bundle of fury held at arm's length before him. "You rascal, you!" the woman scolded, taking the child and administering an automatic smack on his plump legs. Then she kissed his rosy cheek. The child stopped screaming at once and settled himself comfortably astride her hip. He rammed a thumb into his mouth and looked at the visitors with round blue eyes. His face was dirty and his head a mass of tangled curls, but even so, it was easy to see how beautiful he was. "You'll be the Montgomerys. I'm Mistress Todd." The woman transferred her attention to the couple standing before her. "Come away in. You must be fair worn out after your journey." "So am I. I'm at to stand here all day waiting to get my cart unloaded. I've work to do," the driver said sourly from behind them. Mistress Todd's wide green eyes flashed scathingly. "Oh, poor man! Are your arms wasted away that you can't unload a wee cart by yourself? Well, well, I suppose Mr. Montgomery will help you while we go into the house." And leaving him at a loss for words, she led Meg into the passageway. "We live above the weaving shop. Here it is." She threw open a door to disclose a large sunlit room, noisy with the clack of looms and the hum of deep voices. Peering over her shoulder, Meg could see men working at 2 of the 4 looms, swaying rhythmically as they threw the shuttles from side to side. "I'll no tell you again. The next one to leave the door on the latch gets his ears warmed," Mistress Todd bawled. "The weighing's wild enough without any help from you." Then she slammed the door shut on the shouted replies and went on upstairs, remarking over her shoulder, "They're no a bad lot, but they need an awful strong hand to keep them in order." And a strong hand was what Mistress Todd had, Meg thought, as she followed her red-haired guide up the narrow dark stairway and into a large spotless kitchen, fragrant with the smell of homemade bread. "Sit yourself down and I'll make some tea." Mistress Todd deposited the baby on a rag rug and handed him a wooden spoon. He immediately began to bang it on the floor. "That's right, my manny. You give these lazy men below a good fast rhythm to work to. This is our Jamie, a wild ragtail of a boy if ever there was one. He's for a soldier for sure, unless he finds himself beneath a horse's hoofs first," his mother said cheerfully. "You've got it all unloaded then," she added as Duncan came in. "There wasn't much to unload." Her eyes twinkled. "Best to start married life light. Not that I did, for Peter's first wife died and I came to a ready-made home when I wed him. He had 2 grown lads too. Now he's on his second family." She nudged the baby with her toe. "And Peter says this one's more bother than Matt and Colin put together. You'll have some ale, Mr. Montgomery?" "I wouldn't mind," he said gratefully, and drained half the tankard in one thirsty swallow when she handed it to him. The tea was being poured out when Peter Todd himself arrived. "So, you're here already? I'd have been home to greet you, but I had some linen to deliver." "And you got talking," his wife finished the sentence for him, nodding at Meg. "They say women enjoy a gossip, but you'll find that in Paisley, the men know how to do their share of tongue-wagging." Peter Todd let the remark run off his broad shoulders as he studied the couple before him. He was a big, handsome man, with a head of thick white hair and shrewd eyes of the same vivid blue as his son's. "So, this my new man, is it? Well, we'll get on together, if you're prepared to work. We all work hard in this house." "You'll find nobody more willing than Duncan," Meg said sharply. "Mr. Brodie was fair vexed to lose him." Then she coloured as Duncan shushed her. Peter nodded calmly. "I know that, lass, for Mr. Brodie himself recommended your man to me. I see a spinning wheel downstairs. Is it yours?" Now it was Duncan's turn to boast. "Meg's as good a spinster as anyone." "I'll be glad of her help, then, for this wee skelf keeps me away from my wheel often now that he's found his feet." Kirsty Todd disentangled Jamie's groping hands from her hair and handed the child to her husband. The little boy buried his face in his father's shoulder, and Meg watched, amazed. Her father would never have allowed anyone, even his wife, to see him making a fuss of a child. "This one's going to be a weaver," Peter boasted. "Matt chose the army, and Colin's a grocer now. He had to give up weaving because the fluff bothered his chest. Maybe I'll be spared long enough to teach Jamie how to work the loom." "Of course you'll be spared," his wife hectored. "Show Mr. Montgomery the weaving shop while we see to the meal. And you can tell these men down there to stop leaving the street door on the latch," she shouted after him as he led Duncan downstairs. As she and Meg got the meal ready, Kirsty chattered on without waiting for a response. She talked glowingly about Paisley, as proud of the place, Meg thought, as if she had built it with her own capable hands. "Bragging about the town again, Kirsty?" her husband asked dryly when he and Duncan arrived back upstairs. "That one comes from Dumbarton." She jerked her head in his direction. "And nothing I say'll convince him that this side of the Clyde's better than the other bank." "What's wrong with Dumbarton?" Peter wanted to know. "Nothing, though you were pleased enough to wed a Paisley woman. I'm Paisley born and bred myself," she confided to her guests. "I think they realised that," said her husband, poker-faced. After supper, Jamie was put to bed in the attic room he shared with his parents, and the adults were free to sit round the fire, Kirsty's fingers flying nimbly over a pile of mending. Meg offered to help, and soon she too was working busily, letting the men's talk flow over her bent head. Finally, Peter knocked his pipe out against the chimney head and stretched his arms. "We rise early and sleep early, and before we go to bed, we have a verse or two from the Holy Book." His wife put away her mending and rose to fetch the big family Bible from the corner cupboard. Peter took it from her and placed it carefully on the table. "Do you want to read tonight's passage, lad?" Duncan's face, flushed by the fire, deepened in colour. He glanced at Meg for encouragement, then burst out, "To tell the truth, I'm not much of a hand at reading." "You can't read?" "A wee bit. I learned at the school, but I never took to it. Meg sees to that side of things." "Learning's a fine thing," Peter Todd said mildly. "And there's a lot a man can find in books, whether he's a scholar or a weaver." Then he opened the huge tome and began to read in a slow, clear voice. Kirsty folded her hands in her lap and nodded agreement with the words now and then. The scene reminded Meg so vividly of the final ritual of the day at the farm that she was homesick and comforted at the same time. When the book was closed and put away again, Peter and Kirsty stood up. "Good night to you," he said, with grave courtesy. "We rise at 5 o'clock. Then the Todds departed, up the winding staircase that led to the attic. In their own bedroom, a tiny apartment that had little space for anything but the bed, Meg snuggled up to Duncan's warm body, but resisted his attempts to make love to her. "Shh, they'll hear. But we're wed. I'll be quiet as a mouse. Come on, lass." But she couldn't bring herself to make so free of their new employer's bed on such short acquaintance, and Duncan was finally forced to turn over, grumbling to himself. Meg lay wide-eyed, The room was very dark, and all at once she was grateful for Duncan's presence, protecting her from the ghosts and bogles of the night. She lifted herself onto one elbow. "Duncan," she whispered. "Duncan, I'll learn you to read. Then when we have our own house, you can read from the book every night, like Mr. Todd. It's easy." He heaved himself over onto his back, and she felt his fingers tangle themselves in her soft, loose hair. "My wee Meg." His voice was already thick with drowsiness. "You're a good lass, Meg. You'll see. We'll have a fine home, and our own looms. I'll look after you, Meg." Wrapped in his arms, she slept at last, certain of the fine future they had mapped out for themselves. Chapter 2. Meg and Duncan were quickly caught up in the rhythm of Paisley life. There were 2 other weavers in Peter Todd's shop besides himself and Duncan. One was an irrepressible young man who saw humour in everything. The other, a studious man who kept a pile of books by his loom and loved to hold forth on any subject under the sun. The men's tongues worked as swiftly as their looms. Each morning, Meg and Kirsty saw to the housework, baked, visited the market, and looked after red-headed Jamie, a day's work in itself. Any spare time they had was spent spinning coarse thread for the looms. Their wheels were placed close to a trapdoor that allowed communication between the kitchen and the weaving shop below. When the trap was open, the women could join in the conversation, and the perns or reels of spun thread could be passed down to the weavers as they were needed. When Jamie tired himself out with his continual toddling around and his occasional forays into the street when the door was left open, he was lifted into the big wooden cradle. Then Kirsty slipped her foot into the rope looped to one rocker and rocked him as she tended to her wheel. As well as domestic duties, Kirsty and Meg, as the women of the household, were responsible for the upkeep of the long garden at the back of the house. It was stocked with sweet-scented flowers for the benefit of the bees in the 2 skeps, and there were plenty of bushes where the washing could be spread out to dry. Meg was happy with the Todds, but she longed for a home of her own, where she and Duncan and their coming child could be a real family. Kirsty was sympathetic. "I mind, when Jamie was on the way, Colin was still living here, and I was fair fretting for him to find a place of his own, the soul. Not that I ever let on to him or to his father." She deftly guided thread onto the spinning wheel as she spoke. "Then he and Lizzie wed and moved into the rooms behind the wee grocer's shop. I sometimes think he'd have been better staying here with us." Then she bit her lip and added swiftly, "Not that it's any of my business. He chose Lizzie, and if he's content, that's all that matters." Colin Todd, the grocer, had his father's good looks, but was of slighter build and had none of the older man's vitality. Soft, fair hair helped to give him a fragile air, but when he smiled, which happened rarely, his thin face lit up, and Meg was charmed. When she first met his wife Lizzie, she found it hard to understand why Kirsty, one of the most generous women she had ever known, disliked the girl. Colin's wife was mouse-like, quiet-voiced, her brown hair tucked beneath a clean white lace cap, her eyes lowered. It wasn't until Peter and Kirsty held a gathering for their friends that Meg saw the other side of Lizzie's nature. Then she knew why Kirsty had her doubts about Colin's choice of a wife. When she worked in the shop, Lizzie wore a grey dress, high in the neck, and long-sleeved. But for the social evening, she appeared in a white cambric dress sprigged with yellow, red and blue flowers. It was cut low enough to reveal the swell of surprisingly full breasts, and her slim arms were bare. Long brown hair, stylishly curled, fell about her shoulders, and for the first time Meg noticed and envied Lizzie's tiny waist. The head, that was usually lowered, was now held proudly on a long, slender neck, and her eyes, smoky grey with an almond shape to them, were raised boldly to Duncan's handsome face when they met. "You don't take snuff, Mr. Montgomery." Even Lizzie's voice was different now, self-possessed and attractively husky. Duncan looked puzzled. "I don't." That's why we haven't met before. The women and bairns are in and out of the shop for provisions every day, but the men only come in if they want snuff. Maybe I should think of taking the habit up, he said with clumsy gallantry, and Meg, hovering by his side, felt a flicker of unease run through her. You'll do nothing of the kind, Duncan Montgomery. We've enough to do with our money as it is. The smoky eyes left Duncan's face and flowed over Meg. It was as though Lizzie was seeing her for the first time and assessing her. I hear you're anxious to find a place of your own before your bairn comes. Her gaze moved to rest briefly on Colin, who hovered by her side. Somehow, she managed to make him look insignificant and frail in his brown coat and plain vest. We have no family, yet. All Colin's energy goes into caring for his shop. There was calculated malice in the remark. Colin flushed and Duncan looked puzzled. Then, mercifully, Kirsty interrupted them and the moment was gone. As the evening wore on, the children were carried to the attic bedroom to sleep, packed tightly together on the Todd's bed, until the parents were ready to go home. The men went downstairs to talk around the fire in the loom shop, and the women stayed in the kitchen, most of them with knitting or sewing in their hands. Meg noticed that Lizzie reverted back to her mouse-like nature once the men had gone. She retired to a seat in a shadowy corner, her face hidden by a curtain of hair, her fingers toying with the looped earrings in her small lobes. She brightened noticeably when the menfolk came stamping back upstairs for the musical part of the evening. She stood in the centre of the room, eyes bright and cheeks glowing, and sang in a sweet, strong soprano. Meg turned to look for Duncan and caught him watching Lizzie, with a frown tucked between his brows, as though he was trying to decide what to make of her. Suddenly uneasy, Meg made a small movement towards him, and was relieved when he turned his head and slowly smiled at her, as though wakening from a dream. Are you content with me, Duncan? She asked later when they were in bed together. His hands explored her body tenderly. What a thing to ask, and us wed these 4 months past. Of course I'm content with you. I wish I could sing like Lizzie Todd, and look like her. She waited for his reaction, holding her breath, but he only laughed. I'd no have you any other way, my bonny Meg, he murmured into the valley between her breasts, and Meg was happy. 2 days later, Lizzie Todd, busy at the shop counter, looked up from a list of figures as the door opened. She took in the newcomer at a glance, then went on totalling prices. Neat as a sparrow in her grey gown and white cap, she completed the list, took money from wee Tommy Burns's hot fist, handed change over, and bundled parcels into his arms. Mind that money, she said automatically as he went out. Then she smoothed her skirt and tilted her chin to survey the customer who stood, hands planted on the counter, awaiting her attention. A faint smile curved the corners of her mouth and gave added lustre to her smoky eyes. And what can I do for you, sir? I was thinking, said Duncan Montgomery, that I might buy myself some snuff. Matt Todd, Peter's eldest son, came home on leave from the army soon after the Montgomerys arrived in Paisley. Tall and broad and handsome. He was very like his father, with Peter's boundless energy and extroverted nature. Even Meg, who knew that Duncan was the handsomest man in the town, felt a flutter of excitement when she first set eyes on Matt in the tartan plaid and blue feathered bonnet of the Fusiliers. His coming was the signal for one gathering after another. Everyone wanted to hear of his adventures, and Matt was more than ready to entertain them. His tales of the life a soldier led had the men roaring with delight and the women blushing. When a story became too embarrassing, Kirsty would reach up to slap his curly head and order, "That's quite enough of that! You'll not be bringing any more of those lies into my house, thank you." Lies? Lies? Matt's blue eyes opened wide, and as often as not he swept Kirsty off her feet as though she was a child. Would one of His Majesty's brave soldiers tell his little old mother lies? Then Kirsty, struggling in vain, would shrill, I am not your little old mother. I'm only 6 months older than you, and you're still young enough to get a slap on the ear if you don't put me down this instant. It was then that Meg was most aware of Colin, sitting quietly in a corner, smiling at the fun, but outside it. Lizzie too was quiet when Matt was around, which surprised Meg more than a little. It was Matt's idea that he and Colin should ride in the annual Silver Bells horse race, due to take place in a few days' time. Man, it's a grand event, he enthused one night when the Todds and Montgomerys were together in the kitchen above the weaving shop. Everyone comes to the Silver Bells race. In the old days, the three of us used to ride in it. His eyes blazed blue fire. We could all enter for it again. Not your father, Kirsty said at once. He's not as young as he once was. Aye, my days passed for racing, Peter agreed reluctantly. It's a sport for younger men. To Meg's relief, Duncan declined to take part. He was no horse rider, but she was well aware that although he was now a married man, soon to be a father, there was still a reckless, restless side to his nature, and for a moment she had been afraid that he would take up Matt's suggestion. Then it's you and me, Colin. Just like the old days, eh? No! They had almost forgotten Lizzie was there. Sitting silently beside Colin, her chin was up, and she was glaring at Matt. Risk your own neck if you want to, but leave Colin alone, she said with startlingly open antagonism. His face was suddenly stiff. I didn't realise you cared so much for your man's safety. Lizzie shot him a look of pure venom. Colin's got responsibilities. He's not a thoughtless fool. Then he can speak for himself, Matt said coldly, and turned away from her. What'd you say, Colin? Meg saw Lizzie's hands clench on her lap. Colin's eyes flicked over his wife's face, then lifted to Matt. I'll ride with you, he said, and Lizzie's hiss of rage was almost drowned by Matt's triumphant, Good for you, man. We'll bring the bells home. The town's looms clattered late into the night before the Silver Bells race, so that the weavers could take the next day off. Long after she was in bed, Meg could hear the faint thump of the shuttles racing to and fro, and she pictured the men, red-eyed and weary, working in the lamplight. When Duncan finally came upstairs, he was asleep as soon as he crawled in beside her warm body. Matt had hired 2 horses from a local farmer and had invested enough money in wagers to ensure that if either he or Colin were among the first riders home, he would not be out of pocket. Kirsty and Meg scrubbed the spotless house in readiness for the gathering to be held there after the race. I hope you've plenty in for our guests, Peter said anxiously, and his wife tossed her red head. When have you ever known this house to lack refreshments? Well, I know the celebrations you'll have, whether your own lads win the bells or not, and there'll be plenty for everyone, never you worry. As she walked with Duncan and the Todds to Love Street, where the race was to begin and end, Meg felt the festival atmosphere stirring her blood. Children ran through the thick crowds, squealing like piglets in their excitement. Men congregated in groups to place wagers on the outcome. Women wore their best and brightest clothes. Street vendors had set up stalls at the cross. Strangers flocked into the town from miles around. It was as if the whole of Scotland had congregated in that one small town for the Silver Bells horse race. The council members massed importantly at the starting point, bearing with them the wooden casket which held the silver bells that gave the race its name. Duncan held Meg's arm as they picked their way carefully down the street, skirting refuse heaps. Peter was well known and had no difficulty in finding a good spot for his party, where they could see the start and finish of the race. Many Fusiliers were home on leave like Matt, and their uniforms added an extra splash of colour to the scene. The local gentry were in attendance, gazing loftily over the heads of the crowd from their fine carriages. Kirsty nudged Meg's arm. "There's the Laird of Dundonald," she murmured, indicating a richly dressed young man. "A wild, wild laddie. They say there's nothing to be done with him at all." "Too fond of fighting and womanising," Peter added bluntly. "And he's taken a lot of Paisley's lads on the same track as himself." Colin and Matt were already at the starting post. Their father eyed their mounts critically. "Fine animals. You've still got a good eye for a horse, Matt." The soldier grinned. "There'll be no stopping us." He leaned from the saddle to thump his brother on the shoulder. "A pound says I'll cross the finishing line afore you." Colin's thin face was flushed and handsome, the fragile air gone. Even his voice was stronger, more confident, as he said, "You'll lose your money." "Not me." "Pride goes before a fall," Kirsty reminded Matt, hoisting Jamie more securely on her hip. "Just you do your best, my bonny soldier, and don't be so sure you're always going to be a winner." Colin laughed and nodded agreement. Then his eyes moved beyond Meg's shoulder, and she saw a cloud come over his face. She turned and saw that Lizzie had arrived, demure, in a white linen bonnet and russet gown. The girl's lips were set in a thin line, and splashes of colour in her cheeks matched her short scarlet cloak. She looked at her husband unsmilingly, then turned away to scan the crowd. Colin's shoulders slumped for a moment, then he straightened in the saddle, his mouth as firm as Lizzie's. Nobody else seemed to have noticed the angry, wordless exchange between husband and wife. Colin should have found someone better, Meg thought, and realised that she shared Kirsty's misgivings. The senior baillie raised his hand and the crowd hushed at once. The riders jostled their mounts into position. The town officer bawled in a surprisingly high, thin voice for such a brawny man. "Mind these bairns! Clear the way now!" Then the signal was given and the horses were off, their riders yelling like savages, the crowd screaming encouragement. Meg had a brief final glimpse of Colin sweeping past, mouth open in a full-throated roar, eyes glowing. Matt followed, crouching over his horse's neck. There was a mad flurry of hooves and noise, and the riders were gone, plunging in a tight-packed bunch down the narrow thoroughfare and round the corner into St. James's Street. From there, they had to go onto the Shambles Road, then circle back to the Love Street starting point. "My certies, what I wouldn't give to be one of them!" Peter boomed as the last horse swept out of sight, and the yells of the crowd in St. James's Street drifted back to them. "No doubt, but it's time you realised that you're too old for such ploys," Kirsty said mercilessly. "But not too old for everything, eh, lass?" Her irrepressible husband slid an arm about her shoulders, and she fended him off with a scandalised, "Peter Todd, will you mind where you are?" He took out a small box and helped himself complacently to a pinch of snuff. "I'm at the Silver Bells horse race, and the bells will belong to the Todd's house tonight. It's grand to be the father of sons, Duncan. Before we know it, Jimmy here'll be riding for the bells." Kirsty rubbed her chin against her son's head. "Maybe, for he's as wild as you and Matt ever were. But there's time enough, is there not, my wee man, eh? You'll not be in a hurry to grow up." "Don't cuss at him, Kirsty," Peter cautioned. But Meg, feeling the child in her womb flutter at that very moment, knew what the other woman meant. She longed to hold her own baby in her arms, and when that day came, she would be in no hurry to see him, or her, grow up and away from her. Small boys, as often as not inarticulate with excitement, deftly stitched their way through the crowds, carrying the latest news. "Will Rob in front? Gordon Ogilvy's horse went lame on him. Matt and Colin Todd are well up." The messages were passed from mouth to mouth, and Peter almost danced with anticipation, craning his neck to see the end of the road where the first riders would soon appear. The full-throated roar was a dull rumble at first, swelling as it swept nearer. Even Lizzie was caught up in the tension, standing on tiptoe to see the winner come in. Peter scooped Jamie from Kirsty's arms and held him high. Meg gripped Duncan's arm as she heard someone shout, "Here they come!" Then the ground shook beneath her feet as the horses pounded back into Love Street, their red-faced riders clinging on for dear life. Lumps of dried mud sprayed up either side as they galloped past the line, a huge bay in front with 3 others fighting for second place behind it. "Pat McGregor! It's Pat!" a man yelled as the winner, a jovial Paisley cobbler, whooped and threw his bonnet in the air. Peter Todd stood aghast. "Would you credit it? They're not there! Not a sign of them! What the blazes do they think they're up to, the pair of knuckle-headed clumsy—" Now, Peter," his wife admonished. "It's only a race. They did their best, I'm sure." "Not a very good best," he was beginning, when one of the Baileys came hurrying over, an urchin at his heels. "Peter, this lad says there's been an accident just round the corner. One of your boys. They've sent for a physician." But Peter was already shouldering his way through the throng. Kirsty thrust Jamie at Duncan and followed, snatching at Lizzie's wrist as she went and towing the girl along behind her. "Duncan!" A chill had taken hold of Meg's limbs. "Come on, lass, we might be needed." He put his free arm about her and helped her along, stumbling through the dense crowd, pushing against the flow of people, for everyone else was flocking to the winning line. They rounded the corner and found a knot of men standing in the middle of the road. Some horses, steaming after their frantic gallop, were being held by wide-eyed, gawping boys. In the middle of the group, Matt knelt beside Colin, who lay in a careless, oddly boneless heap, as though a giant hand had picked him up, then tossed him aside. His eyes were closed, and his fair hair was bloody over one temple. As the Montgomerys arrived, Kirsty dropped to her knees and lifted her stepson's head onto her lap. Peter's hands moved carefully over Colin's limbs. Lizzie stood looking on. "I'd not move him too much, lass," Peter said quietly. "It looks bad." Matt rubbed both hands over his paper-white face. It happened so fast." He stumbled over the words, as though the language was new to him. "We were out in front and he'd just shouted to me that he'd take the bells for sure. Then his horse must have put his foot in a hole, the daft gawk. Why couldn't he have been watching out for it?" He added in a burst of anguished fury. "He went over its head and landed on his back, on the dyke." They all looked at the low wall, at its hard, sharp stones. "God help us," Kirsty whispered, stroking Colin's bloodied hair. Jamie, sensing that something was wrong, began to weep and punch at Duncan's shoulder. Meg took him, clasping the wriggling little body close for comfort. "It was so quick," Matt said again, then reeled back as Lizzie broke out of her trance and flew at him, her hands clawing for his eyes. "It's your fault!" she screamed at him. "It's always you! Why did you have to come back here and spoil everything, Matt Todd? Why did you have to come back?" Chapter 3. Colin Todd survived the accident that marred that year's Silver Bells race, but his back was broken and he was paralysed from the waist down. In the space of a few seconds...